Long before Japan had surrendered, moves had been made in the Allied camp to begin thinking about punishing those Japanese who had been responsible for starting the war and for promulgating so many war crimes during its course. No one had predicted exactly when the war was going to end, but by early 1944 it was clear that Germany and Japan were losing, but both remained formidable opponents who were to spring many surprises on the Allies before the year was out. In Europe, Hitler's forces would be kicked out of France by the D-Day landings and the subsequent Allied advance east, but German troops would defeat a British and American attempt to cross the Rhine before the end of 1944 at the Battle of Arnhem. A few months later, Hitler had gathered sufficient forces to launch the Ardennes offensive, his last gamble in the West. In the Far East, Japanese forces had struck suddenly at India with the twin campaigns of Kohima and Imphal. But to most Allied planners, it appeared that it was only a matter of time, perhaps up to 2 years, before the Axis was defeated, so laying the foundations of war crimes tribunals was sensible forward planning. The United Nations War Crimes Commission formed a Far Eastern and Pacific subcommittee as the Allies geared up to begin gathering evidence against alleged Japanese war criminals in May 1944. The subcommittee's work would not really begin for some time to come, as Japan was still stubbornly resisting Allied efforts to defeat her. Because of the nature of the membership of the subcommittee, its legal and diplomatic members, drawn from a total of 11 different nations, administrative and executive tasks fell onto the shoulders of the Allied authorities, who actually had military control over the liberated countries. When Japan surrendered, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed the military administrator of Japan, and he established an International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the IMTFE, in January 1946, more commonly known as the Tokyo Trials. The IMTFE would try the big fish, those Japanese government and military officials who had planned and waged the war in the Pacific between 1941 and 1945. They were accused and tried for 3 types of crime. Class A, crimes against peace, Class B, war crimes, and Class C, crimes against humanity, committed during the Second World War only. The crimes committed by Japanese forces in nationalist China and occupied Korea between 1937 and 1945 were outside of the remit of the IMTFE, and instead the Chinese authorities instituted 13 tribunals themselves. The most important convened at the capital, Nanjing, and 504 Japanese were convicted by these bodies and 149 subsequently executed. The first classification of the IMTFE, crimes against peace, referred to the leaders' joint conspiracy to begin and then wage aggressive war, while the latter 2 classifications referred to alleged atrocities committed by Japanese naval and military forces. Subordinate and junior officers, many of whom actually conducted the killings personally or at least ordered and supervised them, were to be dealt with separately from the IMTFE by a series of tribunals established by the victorious Allied powers throughout the 2 areas under their control. SEAC, Southeast Asia Command, under the control of the British, under Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, and Southwest Pacific Area Command, SWPA, under the control of the Americans. The IMTFE convened for the first time on the 3rd of May 1946. 25 former Japanese military and political leaders were charged with Class A crimes, the most famous being the former Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, and a further 300,000 Japanese were charged with Class B or C crimes at dozens of tribunals held throughout Asia and the Pacific. The Australians, due to the fact that so many of their servicemen and nationals had fallen into Japanese hands during the war, were particularly interested in seeing some measure of justice meted out to those responsible for war crimes. 21,726 Australians had become prisoners of war of the Japanese, with 7,412 dying, that is 34%, the highest death rate amongst all Allied POWs of the Japanese. Australian military courts charged 924 Japanese nationals with war crimes, and of these, 496 were convicted and given prison terms. Another 153 were found guilty of murder and executed. The numbers of British and Commonwealth military dead murdered by the Japanese within the SEAC area of responsibility makes for sobering reading. Great Britain had 50,016 men and women taken prisoner, of which 12,433 died. That is a death rate of 25%. India had 55,000 taken prisoner, with around 11,000 dying in Japanese camps. Canada had 1,691 taken prisoner, mostly in Hong Kong, with 273 dying, a death rate of 16%, and New Zealand 121 prisoners of war, with 31 deaths, a death rate of 26%. Lord Mountbatten faced the task of trying to locate those who were responsible for all of this death and suffering from among over 100,000 Japanese troops that he had taken prisoner. It was to prove to be a complicated business, compounded by the difficulties of translating the court proceedings from English into Japanese, and the proceedings were further constrained by budgetary problems due to Britain's shattered economy and the shipping home of thousands of potential witnesses straight after the liberation for medical treatment and convalescence. Some measure of justice was taken by SEAC, operating to arrest and punish war criminals through the auspices of the American occupation authorities in Tokyo against those Japanese who had committed war crimes during the occupations of Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, and Sumatra. These areas had been designated as Lord Mountbatten's responsibility. The officer in overall charge of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia and who bore command responsibility for the horrendous treatment of POWs, internees, and the civilian populations within the occupied territories, unfortunately escaped British justice. Field Marshal Count Heisachi Terauchi, commander of the Southern Expeditionary Army Group covering the entire SEAC area, had personally surrendered to Mountbatten in Saigon on the 30th of November 1945 after a stroke had prevented him from travelling to Singapore for the formal surrender on the 12th of September. While he was in a prisoner of war camp in Malaya, Terauchi suffered another stroke and died on the 12th of June 1946 before he was brought to trial. However, justice was exercised over many of Count Terauchi's subordinates, all of whom had the blood of prisoners and internees on their hands. The officer who had signed in Terauchi's stead at Singapore, Lieutenant General Seishiro Itagaki, did not escape punishment. As commander of the 7th Area Army covering Singapore and Malaya and of the 25th Army defending Sumatra, the 66-year-old was suspected of many crimes, and he was arrested on the order of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, SCAP, General MacArthur's new title as Governor of Japan. Itagaki was arraigned for trial and charged with the commission of war crimes, specifically with the Japanese seizure of Manchuria in 1931 as background to leading Japan into the Second World War, his escalation of the war against the Allies during the term he served as war minister, and for permitting the inhumane treatment of POWs during his term as commander of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia. He was found guilty at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East and hanged at Sugamo Prison, Tokyo, on the 21st of December 1948. Lieutenant General Takashi Sakai had commanded the forces that had captured Hong Kong in December 1941 and had afterwards served as military governor of the British colony. During the Japanese occupation, POWs and internees had been maltreated, and a campaign of terror against Chinese civilians had been waged. Sakai was arrested by SCAP and charged with a host of crimes. He was given to the Chinese, who hauled him before the War Crimes Military Tribunal convened at the Ministry of National Defense in Nanjing. 59-year-old Sakai was executed by firing squad on the 30th of September 1946. Another former governor of Hong Kong, General Rensuke Isogai, was also arrested on the orders of SCAP. He was also extradited to Nanjing and was charged with committing war crimes in Hong Kong. Sentenced to life imprisonment, he was released by Chairman Mao's communist regime in 1952 and allowed to return to Japan, where he died in 1967 at the age of 81. Once Burma had been occupied in 1942, the Japanese had installed a military force to garrison the country. designated the Burma Area Army. This unit was responsible for the Burma-Thailand Railway, the notorious Railway of Death, and a multitude of atrocities committed against military and civilian prisoners. The commander of the army for the latter part of the occupation was General Haitiro Kimura. He was arrested after the war and arraigned before the Tokyo trials. Found guilty of war crimes committed against military and native civilian prisoners who slaved on the Railway of Death, Kimura was hanged on the 23rd of December 1948. The Japanese military governor of Sumatra from February 1944 until the end of the war was Lieutenant General Takuma Nishimura. During the Battle of Malaya in 1941–42, Nishimura had commanded the Imperial Guards Division and was implicated in the barbaric murders of Australian and Indian wounded taken prisoner at Parit Solong. He was also implicated in the Sook Ching massacre in Singapore, where the Kempei Thai military police was let loose on the Chinese population shortly after the British surrender. Thousands of people were machine-gunned on the beaches in huge massacres after they had been accused of supporting the Chinese nationalists or of being anti-Japanese. Tried by the British in Singapore, Nishimura was found guilty of involvement in the Sook Ching massacre and sentenced to life imprisonment. After serving 4 years, he was being sent back to Japan by ship to serve out the remainder of his sentence when Australian military police forcibly removed him at Hong Kong. Nishimura was sent to trial on Manus Island in the Pacific, where he was charged with ordering the Parit Solong massacre. Found guilty, Nishimura was sentenced to death and hanged on the 12th of June 1951. A Kempei Thai colonel and Lieutenant General Suburo Kawamura were also arraigned for the Sook Ching massacre by the British and hanged shortly after the war. The British and the other Allies were not only interested in the senior officers who had condemned thousands to death with the sweep of brush and ink, but also the junior ranks of officers and NCOs who had waded in the gore of innumerable crimes against humanity. The British conducted relatively extensive war crimes trials in 23 cities across Asia, based upon the regions of Singapore, Malaya, North Borneo, Burma and Hong Kong. SEAC was placed in charge of investigating and prosecuting suspected Japanese war criminals, particularly concerning war crimes against former British POWs. This was difficult, largely because Mountbatten had ordered the evacuation of as many POWs and internees as possible from Singapore and Malaya so that they might recover their health in India, Australia and Britain. The British, nonetheless, managed to collect 35,963 witness statements, as well as questioning local people about war crimes that they had actually seen. The local populations of areas that had been under Japanese occupation at the time of the alleged war crimes were of primary importance to the British investigation, and they provided detailed descriptions and statements, particularly concerning the infamous Sook Ching massacre of Chinese in Singapore that led to several lower-ranking Japanese being hanged or imprisoned. After a process of 4 months of interviews and gathering evidence had been completed, the first war crimes trial opened in Singapore on the 21st of January 1946 under the aegis of the British military administration, and by May, 8,900 suspects were under arrest throughout the SEAC area. However, less than 1,000 of these ever saw the inside of a courtroom. The British investigation was hampered from the beginning, as mentioned earlier, by a lack of staff, particularly translators, and by a shortage of money. The full effort of SEAC was in getting servicemen repatriated, rather than seeking justice for those who had already died. Quote, although British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin stated in February 1946 that regarding the Far East, I agree that high priority should be given to trials of minor war criminals, this was largely to be an unfulfilled ambition. After 1947, the number of staff investigating Japanese war crimes was reduced, and the final British trial in Singapore came to an end in December 1948. End quote. Overall, the British executed 223 Japanese by hanging for war crimes, which was far less than ultimately deserved this punishment. This figure does not take into account the Japanese who were killed in cases of instant retribution by prisoners and liberating troops, though on the whole most British soldiers and ex-POWs were remarkably restrained. It was a fact that unless a Japanese war criminal was convicted, sentenced to death, and executed, it was likely that most of them would escape serious punishment for their crimes. Compared with the sentences and prison terms served by many Nazi war criminals, many of whom remained in jail for the rest of their natural lives, the treatment of Japanese war criminals was laughable, and the result of a whitewash campaign hatched between the United States and the Japanese government. By 1950, most war crimes trials were over. In prisons across Asia, Japanese and collaborationist war criminals languished. Although some executions were still outstanding, most were subsequently commuted to life sentences as the Allied nations suddenly lost their appetite for justice as the Cold War diverted their attention and resources onto more pressing matters. Some courts had already reduced sentences and paroled selected criminals. A campaign for amnesty for war criminals emerged in Japan in the early 1950s. Although Japan was still under occupation by General MacArthur's SCAP forces, the economy was rapidly recovering, due in no small part to generous American loans, and the Japanese government and people felt secure and confident enough to challenge the very validity of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East and all the other associated war crimes trials. They found in the Americans a willing and attentive audience who were more than happy to address the thorny issue of war criminals in return for Japan becoming a close ally in the fight against the spread of world communism. Many in Japan were already labeling the Tokyo trials as victor's justice. General MacArthur issued a directive on the 7th of March 1950 that automatically reduced life sentences by 1/3 for good behavior. Parole was to be authorized after 15 years' imprisonment. At this time, many war criminals claimed that they were in ill health, and they were duly released from prison as free men. After the San Francisco Peace Treaty came into effect in April 1952, officially ending the war between the United States and Japan, a Japanese movement vociferously demanded the release of all Class B and C war criminals from prison. The group argued that the original trials lacked validity under Japanese law and were examples of victor's justice, and that the families of these men had suffered hardship and misery as a result of their imprisonment. The Japanese government, keen to gain popular support, jumped onto the bandwagon and added its own voice to the argument. It stated that, quote, "Public sentiment in our country is that the war criminals are not criminals. Rather, they gather a great sympathy as victims of the war, and the number of people concerned about the war crimes tribunal system itself is steadily increasing." End quote. Incredibly, after all the blood, sweat, tears, and treasure that the United States had expended on defeating Japan, the American government proceeded to cynically encourage this view to take hold in Japan. The Truman administration allowed the exigencies of the Cold War to blind them to the dangerous trend of historical revisionism in Japan. Lord Mountbatten had stated in a telegram to MacArthur shortly after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that led partially to the Japanese capitulation, quote, "I am sure that your views coincide with mine, namely, that it will be the greatest mistake to be soft with the Japanese. The fact that you have been prevented from inflicting the crushing defeat will, I fear, enable the Japanese leaders to delude their people into thinking they were defeated only by the scientists and not in battle, unless we can so humble them that the completeness of defeat is brought home to them." End quote. MacArthur and Truman did exactly what Mountbatten warned them against. They allowed the Japanese to challenge the historical truths of their defeat, and in releasing war criminals early, they sent a message to the Japanese that the validity of the trials was open to question, and that the Emperor's armed forces had not technically done anything wrong. As Japan has grown economically stronger over the following decades, so too has her unwillingness to admit to her status as an aggressor nation in the war. Of course, this revisionist attitude was not helped by MacArthur's refusal to prosecute any member of the Imperial family, several of whom were suspected of intimate involvement in war crimes. Historians have made several allegations against members of the Japanese Imperial family, though these have never been proved owing to the closure of the Imperial archives to scholars and the widespread destruction of incriminating evidence by the Japanese in the days following the surrender. Emperor Hirohito was long suspected of having had a far more influential position in the government of wartime Japan than has ever been admitted. This image running contrary to the post-war myth promulgated by the Japanese with American support that portrayed Hirohito as a harmless botanist carried along unwillingly or ignorantly by events. Several other male members of the imperial family subsequently came under close scrutiny by historians, demonstrating that the commission of war crimes went to the very top of the Japanese establishment. One of Hirohito's younger brothers, Prince Chichibu, served through the war in China and the Pacific as an army officer. After 1942, he was retired from active service as a major general because of tuberculosis. However, as a battalion commander in the 37th Infantry Regiment in 1937-38, he was present in Nanjing just after the infamous rape. Historians have also suggested that Prince Chichibu headed Operation Golden Lily, during which the Japanese systematically looted the occupied territories of art treasures, bullion, and cash, most of which has never been recovered. Chichibu died of tuberculosis in 1953, aged 50. Prince Asaka, Hirohito's uncle-in-law, was a lieutenant general during the rape of Nanjing and in temporary command of all Japanese forces in the city because of the incapacity of the field commander, General Iwane Matsue, who was hanged for war crimes after the war. Asaka allegedly issued an order to kill all captives to the army, sanctioning the massacre of over 300,000 Chinese. Asaka certainly issued no orders to stop the carnage. He died in 1981, aged 93. Another male relative of Hirohito's, his first cousin Prince Takeda, was a lieutenant colonel at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. He had executive responsibility for Unit 731, the Japanese Army's biological and chemical warfare research facility in Manchuria, where tens of thousands of Chinese, Russian, and Allied prisoners were cruelly experimented on and murdered. Some historians have suggested that Takeda had a more direct role in Unit 731, including visiting the facility and watching experiments taking place that resulted in mass death. He died in 1992, aged 83. Finally, Prince Higashikuni, Japan's first post-war prime minister, who held office between August and October 1945, and Hirohito's uncle, was a career soldier who was latterly head of the Army Air Service during the war. As commander of the Home Defense Command from 1941 to 1944, he ordered the illegal executions of American airmen captured during the Doolittle bombing raid on Tokyo in 1942, and promulgated orders to execute all captured Allied aircrew as war criminals. Prince Higashikuni died in 1990 at the age of 102. Hirohito and Princes Chichibu, Asaka, Takeda, and Higashikuni were never placed on trial for their lives because General MacArthur protected them. MacArthur actively colluded with his own intelligence organizations and the Japanese government to protect the imperial family from being prosecuted, because he wanted to use them to increase his authority over the Japanese people and to maintain stability within the country. Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, MacArthur's intelligence chief, was ordered to allow the major non-imperial war crime suspects who were to be tried in Tokyo at the IMTFE to coordinate their stories to spare the emperor from being indicted. John Dower, author of Embracing Defeat, writes that, quote, with the full support of MacArthur's headquarters, the prosecution functioned in effect as a defense team for the emperor, end quote. The ammunition this decision gave to later Japanese revisionists was huge. Quote, MacArthur's truly extraordinary measures to save Hirohito from trial as a war criminal had a lasting and profoundly distorting impact on Japanese understanding of the lost war, end quote, writes Herbert Bix. On the 4th of September 1952, President Harry S. Truman issued an executive order establishing a clemency and parole board for war criminals. Then, on the 26th of May 1954, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, while rejecting a proposed amnesty for all Japanese war criminals, nonetheless reduced the period required for eligibility for parole to 10 years. By the end of 1958, every Japanese war criminal had been released from prison. No protests were made by any of the Allied governments, and these men were welcomed as heroes back into Japanese society without any stigma of shame or criticism attached to them. All of this had only been made possible by General MacArthur's protection of key war crime suspects and in the creation of a culture that permitted and encouraged the dismissal of the uncomfortable truths of the past for the exigencies of the present. It was the final betrayal of the memory of all those men, women, and children who had suffered and died in Japanese concentration camps. Justice had been denied to the victims of Japanese imperialism by self-serving Allied leaders like MacArthur, whose actions in the immediate aftermath of the war were driven more by political expediency and self-aggrandizement. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my video channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.